General Hospital will reveal interesting facts on Wednesday, May 28, 2025. First, after a long and grueling recovery abroad, Michael finally returned to Port Charles, stepping back onto familiar soil during the most glamorous and emotional night of the year, the Nurses' Ball. His arrival was nothing short of dramatic, and yet deeply symbolic, as he walked into the event and gently reached out to take his son from Willow's arms. The crowd barely noticed at first, but those closest to him, those whose lives had been marked by his absence, froze in disbelief, their emotions tumbling over themselves like waves crashing into the shore. For Michael, the moment was both surreal and grounding. After all his time in Germany, battling through pain and silence, he was finally home. The first to reach him was Carly, tears of joy brimming in her eyes as she wrapped him in a trembling embrace. There was no hesitation, no anger, only pure maternal relief. Beside her, Jocelyn was stunned, the shock on her face slowly replaced by a wide, genuine smile. She had feared for so long that she might never see her brother again, but here he was, alive, standing tall, and more composed than she ever remembered. Even Sonny, hardened by battles both personal and professional, allowed his emotional guard to drop as he approached his son, his voice unsteady but his presence unwavering. In that brief circle of reunion, the Corinthos family found something rare, peace. For Michael, the warmth that surrounded him was overwhelming. His bond with his family, though once fractured by conflict and distance, seemed to mend instantly under the weight of shared relief. The embrace of Carly, the spark of pride in Sonny's eyes, the welcome from Jocelyn, these were not just familial gestures. They were lifelines, anchoring Michael back into a life he had feared he might never reclaim. Every smile, every pat on the back, every teary-eyed glance reminded him of how deeply his roots had grown in this town, in this family, in this place. But not everyone welcomed Michael with open arms. While the crowd applauded, while Carly beamed and Sonny's silence said everything, there were two figures who remained on the fringes of the celebration, watching with guarded eyes. Willow stood rigid, her expression unreadable, holding herself tightly as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Drew stood by her side, his jaw clenched, unsure whether he was witnessing a family reunited, or a storm slowly brewing. They had carried the burdens Michael left behind, raised the children, made the decisions, and tried to keep order. His sudden return, unannounced and so publicly triumphant, threatened to unravel all they had carefully built. To Willow, this moment was not merely about Michael's return. It was about uncertainty, about the pain that had come from moving forward only to be pulled back. She remembered the late nights, the fear, the waiting. And then the decision to survive without him. Now, seeing Michael so confidently step back into a father's role felt almost like a betrayal. It wasn't anger she felt, it was confusion, guilt, fear, and perhaps a hint of longing. But none of those emotions were easy to voice while everyone else was celebrating his return. She smiled faintly when others looked her way, but it never reached her eyes. Drew, on the other hand, saw Michael's reappearance as both a challenge and a threat. He had stepped up not just as a guardian to Wiley but as a partner to Willow, a provider, a stabilizing presence. Michael's return called all of that into question. He knew the Quartermaines would rally behind Michael, and so would Sonny's empire. But would Willow? Would Wiley? Would all that they had weathered together be forgotten the moment Michael opened his arms? Drew didn't blame Michael for surviving, but he feared that survival came with entitlement, that Michael would reclaim everything without truly understanding what had been sacrificed in his absence. Amid the applause and whispered amazement at Michael's return, deeper undercurrents of tension began to swirl. Tracy, ever the strategist, kept her reactions muted but calculated, already pondering what Michael's return meant for ELQ and the family's fortune. Brook Lynn looked on with cautious optimism, wondering if her cousin's homecoming would heal or divide them further. Even Olivia, warm and maternal as ever, watched Willow closely, reading between the lines of every tight smile and every glance not shared with Michael. Port Charles was welcoming back one of its sons, but not without questions. Michael himself could feel the strain beneath the surface. He was not oblivious. The reunion felt good, but it wasn't clean. There were fractures. Moments that felt too choreographed, faces that smiled too quickly. As he stood in the middle of the ballroom, holding Wiley close, he could sense that his journey was far from over. Redemption, reconciliation, reintegration, these were not things he could simply declare. They would have to be earned. His return had sparked celebration, yes, but also discomfort. He would have to walk a narrow line between gratitude and humility, between reclaiming his place and respecting what had changed. And yet, as the evening wore on, Michael remained steady. He greeted old friends, accepted the hugs, shook the hands, and listened patiently to every wish of welcome. But in his mind, one thought persisted like a drumbeat: Willow. Her silence echoed louder than the applause. Her distance, more painful than his months in Germany. He knew there would be a reckoning. Not tonight. But soon. And whatever it would take, whether time, truth, or tears, he was ready. Because for the first time in a long time, Michael wasn't just surviving. He was ready to fight for his family. Second, Gio had spent his entire life searching for a sense of belonging that always felt just out of reach. When the truth finally emerged, that Dante and Brook Lynn were his biological parents, it did not come as a warm revelation or a joyous reunion. Instead, it tore open every old wound he had learned to hide. The idea that his mother and father had lived their lives mere blocks away, building their futures, loving others, raising families, while he existed unnoticed and unloved, left Gio feeling not just abandoned, but invisible. His heart was not ready to forgive, not ready to understand. All he could feel was the emptiness of all those years when no one came for him. The hardest part for Gio wasn't just discovering who his parents were, but realizing they had never searched for him. Even now, after the truth had been revealed, it wasn't their love that brought them to his door, it was guilt, perhaps desperation. In his eyes, their presence now did not undo the absence that defined his entire childhood. Every birthday that passed without a card, every school event with no one in the audience, every sleepless night filled with questions and tears, all of it weighed heavier than any apology they could offer. How could he accept their love when it arrived so late, when it followed years of silence? Brook Lynn stood before him with tears in her eyes and trembling hands, her heart aching with regret. She spoke of how she would have done anything had she known, how she never would have let him grow up without her. But to Gio, these were just words, words that came too late to soothe the hurt he had carried for so long. Her sorrow was real, but so was his pain. He remembered falling asleep wondering if his mother was out there thinking of him, and now that he knew she wasn't, the revelation left a bitter taste. It was easier to believe she had died, than to know she lived and simply didn't know, or didn't look. Dante's presence didn't ease the storm inside Gio either. The decorated officer, the principled man admired by so many, stood before his son with his head bowed in shame. Gio couldn't see the hero others saw. He saw only a man who had failed to protect him, a man who never knew the sound of his child's laughter, never taught him how to ride a bike or kissed a scraped knee. Every moment Gio had needed a father, Dante had been elsewhere. Even now, his regret rang hollow, because it echoed through years where there should have been love and guidance. Gio had become a man without ever being someone's son. When they asked him to talk, to sit down and hear their story, Gio had no words to give. His silence wasn't defiance, it was survival. He had learned early on that silence was safer than hope. He didn't want to relive the past, he had spent too long trying to outrun it. They wanted connection, but Gio only felt the sharp edge of betrayal. In their eyes, he saw hope for reconciliation. In his own, he saw nothing but the reflection of a childhood spent wondering why he wasn't good enough to be loved. And now, they stood before him with open arms, expecting him to walk into them without hesitation. What they didn't understand was that Gio had built his life around not being wanted. It became part of his identity, something he wore like armor. To let them in now would mean tearing that armor off and exposing wounds that had never fully healed. He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't ready to feel everything all at once. The anger, the longing, the disappointment, and the part of him that still, despite everything, wanted to be loved by them. But love, to Gio, wasn't something you could give after the fact. It had to be there when it mattered. And for him, it hadn't been. He left without looking back. Not because he hated them, but because he needed space to breathe, to think, to feel something other than grief. As he walked away, Brook Lynn called his name, her voice breaking, but he didn't turn around. Dante stood motionless, his eyes full of regret, knowing this was not a moment he could fix with apologies or promises. Joe's departure wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a journey they would all have to take, each at their own pace, through a landscape filled with broken trust and fragile hope. In the days that followed, Gio tried to focus on the routines that had once kept him grounded. Music, work, long walks at night. Things that made him feel whole when everything else was falling apart. But the knowledge that he now had parents, real parents, who wanted to know him, made it impossible to ignore the aching void inside him. It wasn't closure he was seeking. It was clarity. He needed to know if their regret was real, if their love could be more than a reaction to guilt. Most of all, he needed to decide if he could risk his heart again, after guarding it so fiercely for so long. In time, perhaps, Gio would be able to face them again. Perhaps he would sit across from Brook Lynn and let her hold his hand. Maybe he would talk to Dante about everything he missed, not to accuse, but to begin again. But that day had not yet come. For now, Gio needed to grieve the childhood he never had, to mourn the years lost to silence, and to learn who he was without the shadow of abandonment hanging over him. Only then could he begin to understand what it truly meant to be someone's son. Third, Nina sat quietly across from Maxie in the corner of the Metro Court restaurant, her fingers nervously circling the rim of her untouched cup of tea. Her expression was a blend of dread and urgency, a storm quietly brewing beneath the polished exterior she had learned to maintain. Michael's return had shaken her in a way nothing else had. Not just because he was back, but because of what his presence meant for the fragile world Willow had built. Nina had no illusions. Michael wasn't just coming home. He was coming back with a mission, and that mission was revenge. She had seen the fire in his eyes at the nurse's ball, the cold calculation in the way he held Wiley as if reclaiming possession, not family. Michael had suffered. Nina understood that. But she also understood something far more dangerous. A man like Michael, once broken, would return not to mend, but to conquer. And the first to fall would be Willow and Drew. They had tried to build a new life in his absence, a life that had become a threat to Michael's pride and pain. Nina feared that Willow was unprepared for what was coming. She might still see Michael as the man she once loved. But that man was gone. Maxie, ever the perceptive one, could tell something was wrong before Nina even opened her mouth. But as Nina finally spoke, her voice low, her words carefully chosen, Maxie listened intently, eyebrows slowly rising in surprise. Nina laid it all bare. Michael's quiet fury, his cold detachment, the eerie calm that masked a hunger for control. Nina had watched him that night and realized he had already made up his mind. Wiley and Amelia would be his again, no matter the cost. And Willow? Willow would be left in ruins if no one intervened. The thought of watching Willow suffer again was unbearable. Nina had made many mistakes, some of them irreversible, but she still loved her daughter, fiercely and without condition. And Drew, for all his flaws and his own share of secrets, had been a steady anchor for Willow. They had built something that resembled peace. But Nina knew Michael would not respect that peace. He would tear it down, brick by brick, and call it justice. Nina feared that by the time Willow realized what was happening, it would be too late. That was why she had come to Maxie. She needed to do something. Anything. As she spoke, Nina's words became more desperate, more personal. She didn't want to manipulate. She didn't want to scheme. But she also couldn't stand by and let Michael destroy everything Willow had built. So she had begun to formulate a plan, one that involved gently pulling Willow away from Drew. Not out of spite, but out of strategy. If Willow wasn't so closely tied to Drew, if she could be seen as a separate entity, maybe Michael's wrath would soften. Maybe he wouldn't come at her with such ferocity. Maybe she'd be spared the full weight of his vengeance. Maxie, ever the voice of reason and conscience, paused before answering. She knew how dangerous emotional manipulation could be, even when done out of love. But she also knew Nina's fear was real. She didn't doubt that Michael would fight for his children. She didn't even doubt that he might win. What concerned her more was the fallout, what would be left of Willow after the battle ended. Maxie had seen Willow fragile before, and she remembered how close to the edge she had come. Another loss, especially at Michael's hands, might be the one she couldn't recover from. Nina asked Maxie what she thought, if it was wrong to try and gently push Willow away from Drew, or at least create space. Not to sabotage, but to protect. She wondered if it would be better to quietly support Willow in a different direction, maybe encourage her to lean more on family, or on herself. Maxie didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and took Nina's hand, reminding her that good intentions often led down messy paths. If Nina truly wanted to help, she needed to be honest with Willow, not plot behind her back. Still, Nina couldn't help but feel cornered. She had been watching the pieces move, and she saw what was coming. Michael had been through hell, and he was bringing it back with him. Whatever compassion he once held was now locked behind walls of pain and pride. He would fight smart. He would fight hard. And Willow was too soft-hearted, too loyal, to see it coming in time. Nina had to act quickly. She didn't know exactly how, but she knew she had to find a way to protect her daughter before the storm Michael carried within him finally struck. As Maxie looked into Nina's eyes, she realized the depth of Nina's fear wasn't rooted in paranoia, it was maternal instinct. Michael might have been Willow's great love once, but the man who returned wasn't the same. And unless someone intervened, unless someone helped Willow understand the war that was already beginning, there might be nothing left to save. Nina wasn't looking for permission. She was searching for a lifeline. And Maxie, torn between caution and compassion, knew they both might be forced to cross lines neither of them ever imagined just to keep Willow safe. Finally, Chase stood motionless backstage at the nurses' ball, the sounds of applause and music muffled by the pounding in his ears. The revelation had hit him like a blow to the chest. Gio, the quiet, troubled young man who had unknowingly become part of their extended world, was the biological son of Brook Lynn and Dante. It wasn't just a surprise. It was a detonation. One that shattered the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his wife, about their relationship, and about the honesty they had built their lives on. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was walk, one foot in front of the other, until he found Brook Lynn. When he did, she was alone, seated in a quiet hallway just off the ballroom, her dress still sparkling under the low lights, but her shoulders slumped in exhaustion and dread. Chase didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, waiting, perhaps hoping, that she would be the one to say something first. But Brook Lynn stayed silent, knowing that the moment had finally come. She had always known it would. What she didn't know was how much it would hurt to see that look in Chase's eyes, the confusion, the betrayal, and beneath it all, the heartbreak. He finally spoke, his voice low but shaking with everything he couldn't contain. He needed answers. Not just about Gio, but about why she hadn't told him. Why she hadn't told anyone. Why she had carried this secret and let it grow between them like a weed threatening to choke out everything they had planted together. He wanted to believe her, to believe in the love they had, but the pain of being left in the dark, of finding out alongside a crowd of strangers, that cut deeper than he expected. This wasn't just a lie of omission. This was a secret that rewrote the past and shattered trust in the present. Brook Lynn's eyes welled with tears as she tried to speak, her voice hoarse and uneven. She told him she didn't know, not until recently, and even then, it had felt like a waking nightmare. The truth had come at her too quickly, too violently. And by the time she processed it, it was already too late. Gio was her son. And Dante's. And everything she thought she knew about the life she had lived had shifted. She didn't tell Chase not because she didn't trust him, but because she couldn't even trust herself to believe what was happening. She was scared, ashamed, and deeply, deeply broken. Chase listened, every word landing like a stone in the pit of his stomach. He believed that she hadn't meant to hurt him, but that didn't erase the hurt. He told her he could have helped. He should have helped. But now, he felt like a stranger standing outside a door she had locked from the inside. The person she turned to in crisis wasn't him. It was Dante. And that truth alone carried more weight than Brook Lynn realized. Chase wasn't just grieving the secret. He was grieving the sudden realization that he hadn't been the center of her world when it mattered most.